You're listening to the EFC Podcast.
Carolyn Arends is a singer, a songwriter, author, a speaker, and director of education for Renovare, which was founded by Richard Foster to help people in their spiritual formation, partly by providing practical resources for cultivating what they call the with God life. My favorite role for her, though, is as a highly valued Faith Today columnist. I'm Karen Stiller, and I spoke with Carolyn about her work as a writer, the beautiful freedom of spiritual disciplines that don't actually feel like disciplines in the way we might usually understand that word, and hope for the people who just can't get their act together in that department. I hope you enjoy this podcast. If you haven't read Carolyn Arends and Faith Today, email me at senioreditor@faithtoday.ca, and I'll make sure you get a copy. So, Carolyn, I would call you one of our beloved Faith Today columnists. People love your work. You win awards. We love you even as we nag you sometimes. And you're also a songwriter. And if I understand your history, that's really where you started. So I would like to throw out this big question to start with, just to ask you to tell us about the role of writing and art in your life as a professional, but also in your faith life.
It's a great question. It's always dangerous when somebody answers a question like that with the words "when I was a child," because
I trust you.
You know it's going to be a long answer. But as a kid, I was really, really shy and found writing, both music and written writing and reading, as a way of kind of finding my voice. So that happened really early on, and very early on became a part of kind of my prayer life, my ongoing conversation with God. So when I was a kid, actually, if you'd asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would have said an author because I loved reading so much. And then when I was about 10, my dad brought a guitar home, and I wrote a song for Mother's Day that was a huge hit in the house, and that started this kind of long love affair with expressing things through music. And now these days it can come out either way, but just any kind of chance to work with language to try to express ultimate things has turned out to be really life-giving to me as a human, and especially life-giving in my back and forth with the God who loves me.
Yeah. One thing that I really like about your work as a writer, and your work in Faith Today magazine specifically, is you have a column space, and you almost always weave in or start with or end with a personal story. And it's more than an anecdote. I don't think you're using the personal story as sort of a prop. You are sharing something from your life and heart that has helped you learn something about God, or that God has used to teach you something. And I love that. And it makes me remember each time the power of being vulnerable and transparent, and also the power of story to connect us. And I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's funny. A few years ago, I was getting my master's at Regent College, and writing a column for another magazine at that time. And all of a sudden my columns got really didactic and really teachy. And my editor at the time said, "You have to stop doing that. It isn't helpful." And it brought back to me the truth that, the primary thing we have to offer is our story. Because that's where things get out of the abstract and down into real life. And if sort of the ideas, I love abstractions, I love concepts, I love working out intellectual models for things, but if they don't have traction kind of down with what happens with our family and what happens in our neighborhoods, then they're kind of useless. That's sort of a take on 1 Corinthians 13. If I could spin out the loveliest ideas, but if they're not incarnated in real human life, then they're kind of a clanging gong. So I really believe in the power of story, and in understanding that each one of us, we're not some little abstraction on this planet. We're part of God's story, which is actually going somewhere. It's not petering out. He's actually working towards the redemption and restoration of all things. So my little story and the little snapshots from my life are kind of part of this bigger story. So I'm a big fan of always kind of reconnecting ourselves with the stories of our lives and God's story. And it saves me from myself and from a world of abstraction.
And I think it takes a certain amount of courage to share those kinds of stories, because they're not usually stories about how smart we are or, how good we are at doing whatever. Like often the stories that we really connect with are usually ones where I can say, oh, Carolyn struggles with that too. Maybe I can have grace with this as well, or something. They call each of us forward. So do you ever wrestle with how transparent to be, or do you have what I think it's Brene Brown who calls vulnerability hangovers the next day?
For sure. And I think even more than a vulnerability hangover, just having discernment around what is helpful to share, what would actually help somebody else in their journey. It's a tricky thing. I think for me, back in my touring days as a recording artist, the very first artist that I did a long tour opening for was a guy named Rich Mullins. Some people will know his music, really wonderful songwriter. And sometimes people would say to him, how do you stay humble when you're on a stage every night? And he would say, oh, no, I stay humble because I'm on a stage every night, because you wouldn't believe how many things go wrong and how often I'm a goof. And, I can't help but be humble because of the reality of my life. And for me, I don't know that I'm necessarily trying to choose really vulnerable and transparent stories so much as they're just the ones. What am I trying to say? I think with it's in my own brokenness and vulnerability that God has the best opportunities to break into my life. It's the Leonard Cohen thing. There's cracks in everything. That's how the light gets in. Or the Apostle Paul, in my weakness is where you're strong. So I'm not trying to only tell stories that put me in a bad light or something like that. But it's just that usually when I'm the goofiest, God is the greatest.
Oh, I love that. That should be a bumper sticker, a new bumper sticker.
So that's just where the best fruit is in those moments of vulnerability.
I mean, and that is when we learn the most from God, isn't it? And when we feel the most loved by Him. I think when we're, not necessarily at our lowest, but when we realize our need. And I think that's more profound than we think it is. We sort of take that for granted, but I think it's deeply true the longer I live.
Yeah. And I think, I think I used to think that as I grew up in faith, it would mean I would get to the end of my rope less often. Mm-hmm. And what I'm learning is that what it actually means is I get to the end of my rope faster. like I have to over and over and over again become reacquainted with my own poverty of spirit, which, Eugene Peterson used to say, recognizing our poverty is just recognizing that we do not have in and of ourselves what it takes to live the kind of life for which we were made. And so now, instead of fighting getting to the end of my own resources quite so hard, I'm able to get there faster and go, oh yeah, right, I don't have what it takes. And so it's a funny definition of progress, but I find I can get there quicker.
Yeah, that is super helpful, actually. And it makes me think about your work. I think of you mostly and fondly as a beloved Faith Today writer, as I mentioned, but you are also, among other things, Director of Education for Renovare. So I'd love for you to tell us all about Renovare and your work there, and then let's dig a little deeper into some of those topics of spiritual formation.
Sure. Yeah. So Renovare is a Christian spiritual formation organization. It was founded by Richard Foster. A lot of people know his book, Celebration of Discipline, which was really kind of a benchmark book on rediscovering ancient Christian practices and rhythms as part of our life with God. And that book, I have a whole funny history with that book, because when I first heard the title Celebration of Discipline, I thought that was about the most unappealing title I had ever heard in my life. Who would celebrate discipline? I'm a musician. But anyway, that book ended up being really important in my own journey, and a whole bunch of different Renovare resources and paradigms have become really important to me in my own life with God, and in chances I was getting to lead retreats and do things like that. And about 4.5 years ago, I had gone to Regent College. I was on a Regent College alumni page, and I saw this little ad that said, Renovare is looking for a director of education. And I don't even think that I knew at that point that Renovare was an organization. I just knew that I'd seen their logo on so many resources that have been helpful to me. But when I saw that, I felt like somebody hit a tuning fork and put it on my chest, and I just started to buzz. And I thought, I think this is what I'm supposed to be when I grow up. So I've ended up getting to work with this amazing, it's actually a remarkably small organization given its reach. And it just exists to help people with their friendship with God, help people be intentional with their life with God. So there is a lot of that is mining the riches of kind of ancient Christian practice of how can we open ourselves up intentionally to what God wants to do in our lives. But I get to splash around and play with that in a bunch of different ways. One is by overseeing something called the Renovare Institute for Christian Spiritual Formation, which is a 2-year program that people take who want to kind of do a deep dive in this way of thinking about life with God. And I also get to do the Renovare Book Club, which this year we've got about 1,800 people going through these great books in the tradition. So it's a really fun job.
When you say, when you talk about that 2-year program, and I had read about that a little bit, and something in me immediately went, directions, instruction, assignments. Like, I can do that, do. And then I thought, maybe I'm not supposed to feel that way. Maybe that's like the opposite of spiritual formation. So I get confused when I think about that stuff, because I feel like, give me work to do, but I'm not sure that's what it's about. Is it?
Well, you're speaking to a tension in my own life too. Yes and no is the answer to that question. Yes. Yeah. I think there is a place for intentionality in our life with God, as there is in anything else. A key text for me is Haggai. Can you believe that, of all places? But the the first chapter of Haggai, the Israelites have been in exile. They've come back home, and they have been meaning to rebuild the temple. And of course, if you follow what happens with the temple in Scripture, the temple represents their intentional life with God, their time with God. And they've been meaning to rebuild it, because when they moved back, it was in ruins, and it's been like 18 years, and they, I totally can see it. They've moved back in, and they're like, well, yeah, we really need to rebuild the temple, but first we need to get our roads happening again, and our houses set up, and our schools, so that our kids are safe. And then as soon as we kind of get the infrastructure back into place, we'll rebuild the temple. And like, they've been meaning to get to it for 18 years. And finally, like through the prophet Haggai, the Lord says something like, actually, I'll read it to you. He says, "Is it time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin?" And then he says, "Give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You put on clothes, but you are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it." It's like, it's so 21st century. It blows my mind. It's like you're living in this land of diminishing returns, where the harder you work, the more behind you are, and it's never, ever enough. And the Lord, through Haggai, diagnoses it, and he says, it's because you haven't put the temple back together. This was meant to be the center of your life, this time with me. And so I read that, and as someone who means to get to a lot of things, and you very kindly referred to my tendency to get my columns in late. I mean to get to my columns, right? This is the tone and character of my life. There are so many things that I mean to get to.
Right.
And this, so the intentionality side of spiritual formation of our life with God is so that we don't get to 60 or 70 years old or to our deathbed and go, oh man, I meant to get to that. Right. So that's the part where, yes, some structure, some intentionality can be helpful, but the goal is always just life and friendship with God. And it's as open-handed and free-spirited and creative as God is. And so, yeah, there's this huge, it's ultimately just all invitation. It's all like, hey, let's play around and figure out the best way for us to connect. So there is this kind of double dance, and in different seasons and maybe for different temperaments, more structure is called for, and in other seasons and other temperaments, more kind of playfulness and freedom and letting go of rules is called for. And I'm giving you a really long answer, but the last thing I'll say is that one of my favorite things I've heard said about Jesus is that he comforts the disturbed and he disturbs the comfortable. And I think he's like that with everything. He offers structure to those of us who are dying for lack of structure, and he offers freedom for those of us who are way overstructured. And it's this constant sort of dance and discernment and journey together of like, how can we best forge this friendship?
Yeah, oh, that's really helpful. And that idea of offering like freedom to the highly structured gives me insight into something that's happened in my life recently, where I finally started going to see a spiritual director, which is something I'd thought about for years. And I met a woman at just the right moment who told me about her spiritual director. And I was like, I am finally going to do this. And I realized that I had maybe too quickly, showed her my cards, because I'm like, give me homework. I really want homework. And she's like, okay, well, I'm not going to give you any homework. And I mean, I begged, and she did throw me a crumb. So I was thankful. But that helps me understand that, that she was understanding a challenge that I clearly am grappling with. So that's helpful.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And that is thrilling to hear you found a spiritual director. That's been a fairly recent part of my life with God too, maybe in the last 4 or 5 years. And boy, that can be such a huge gift, just to have someone who will sit with you and help you listen to God. That's their only job, is just to help you detect the movement of God in your life. And my director is actually very similar. I'm always wanting homework, and she's always just too funny. One of the big phrases we actually use in the Institute is do spiritual disciplines as you can, not as you can't. Like do them in the way where they're bringing life, not in the way where they're not bringing life. And I remember when I first started work, when I first came to the Institute and I heard one of our faculty members teach that, I was scandalized. I was like, well, what if the discipline in question is prayer? Because they would say, if it's not bringing you life, quit. And I would think, well, what if it's prayer? You can't quit praying. But their point was, there's 1,000 ways to pray. There's 1,000 ways, to cultivate a conversation with God. So if the way that you're doing isn't bringing you life, if it isn't producing more fruit in your life of love, then stop it. Do something different, and that's just a whole different way of thinking than I used to think. I used to have spreadsheets and habit trackers and the whole deal, right?
Yeah, that is a very freeing thought. Now, this morning I was on the Renovare site, and this goes, I think, exactly to what you're saying. And there's a page there about spiritual disciplines. I clicked on it excitedly, and I was expecting, of course, to see things like prayer and worship, but actually the list was really long, but in a really good way. Like the simplicity was listed, submission, service, celebration. And I've never thought of celebration as a spiritual discipline, but it resonated deeply with me. I was like, yeah, that totally is a spiritual discipline. So making that list long actually seemed like a wonderful gift. Is that, obviously that's intentional. You guys have thought through that. It's just a broader way of looking at it.
Yeah. And to begin to realize, to begin to kind of heal the split that so many of us have between a sacred and secular, and realize, no, it's all under God's gaze. So, my husband says that mountain biking is one of his most important spiritual disciplines. It's where he gets his best praying done, where he feels most aware of God's movement in the world and in his life. And that, for him, he has to be moving. He's kinesthetic. He has to be moving for prayer to be profitable for him. So some idea of, some sort of cloistered kneeling still thing isn't that helpful. So yeah, the list is very long. In Celebration of Discipline, Foster's work, I think there's about 12 kind of big classic disciplines that he recognizes that include celebration and submission. But then from there, it's really unlimited. We have one of our faculty members, Trevor Hudson. One of his spiritual disciplines is he was trying to cultivate more joy and spontaneity in his life. He can be quite serious. So one of his disciplines is he and his wife have a rule. They usually have the radio on at home. And I think it's if Ed Sheeran or Sam Smith come on the radio, then no matter what they're doing, they have to meet in the kitchen and dance for the duration of that song.
Wow. I love that.
Yeah. And that's part of his rule of life, and part of what he feels God is inviting him into in this season of his life to. So it's pretty creative and pretty fun. I work with Nathan Foster, who's Richard's son. Nate's got this thing where he's always looking for little chances to die, which sounds like, again, when I first heard this, I thought, okay, we need to get some therapy for this guy. But what he means is, he felt like the Lord was inviting him into a season of like, how can you get creative in those little deaths to self that are ultimately freedoms? And so he just started like, when he's parking somewhere and there's it's raining and there's a parking space really close to the door, saying, you know what, I'm going to leave that space for someone else who might be blessed by not having to run in the rain. I'm going to park further away, or I'm not going to take the coveted aisle seat at the movie theater or at church. Just these little tiny invitations. So it can become quite creative and quite adventurous, I think.
And of course, you're finding out about these other spiritual habits of other people because you're in community and you are interacting with them. And I see that in your work and your writing. And I guess I'm bringing us back full circle in a way about being transparent and honest in community. Can you speak to the need for that in our lives as believers?
Yeah, I think it's huge. And really, as an introvert, it's been a long journey for me because I would, left to my own devices, go to a more solitary position. And yet anytime I will take the risk of transparency and availability, like kind of consistent availability to another person or a group of people, there's always so much growth in that. It's fascinating at the Institute, how often people say they were, a lot of them are like you, okay, finally, I'm going to organize my spiritual life and I'm going to have, I'll get evaluated and I'm going to get an A on my life with God. And,
you got my number.
Because I see the same person when I look in the mirror. But anyway, a lot of them, they come into the program expecting certain gifts from the program, which they do receive, but almost always they say the biggest gift it has turned out to be community, especially the introverts, especially the ones who have kind of somewhat avoided community. And they find it kind of astonishing how much we just need to incarnate God's grace and mercy and compassion to each other. That's a big part of his MO. That seems to have been the design from the beginning, that we're meant to do that. So it's become, it's still an area of growth for me to be, well, it's back to that intentionality, to not go, oh, I meant to have coffee with that person and realize it's 3 years later. But yeah, anytime we can intentionally put ourselves into community that's willing to go deep on these things, I think there's just so much promise and potential in that willingness to make ourselves open to other people.
Carolyn, as we wind up, I feel like you've probably already given this, sort of advice or guidance throughout our conversation, but the last question I wanted to ask you was, if somebody was listening to this and was just kind of would consider themselves to be like a wreck at spiritual disciplines, or they just can't get themselves together. I love that idea of do what you can, not what you can't. But what other guidance or encouragement would you give that person?
It's a great question. I think, first of all, to realize that this is all invitation. This isn't anything that we do to earn God's favor or get him to like us more. It's all invitation to discover how much we are already loved. And then to sort of find maybe another person, maybe a spiritual director, just a friend who can help you discern, okay, do I need more structure or do I need more freedom? Like this conversation that we've been having. And then maybe to just try one practice for a season. And that could just be, okay, I'm going to pray a passage of scripture each morning before I look at email or anything online. It's something that maybe has like a trigger or can be stacked with a habit that you already have, and just play around with it and keep tweaking it. But just do one thing. Don't be like I tend to be and have a spreadsheet with 14 columns. Just look for one thing that you sense the Lord might be inviting you into, and just experiment with it for a while. And then again, invite some sort of community, one other person to help you maybe stay accountable to whether you're trying that thing, and also to evaluate whether it really is giving you life, and then just kind of go from there.
Beautiful. Carolyn, thank you so much. Before we say goodbye, where can people find you online and Renovare?
Well, Renovare is at renovare.org, and it's spelled RENOVARE.org. And then I'm at CarolynArends.com, and I'm also on Facebook and Twitter and erratically on Instagram. You can just Google my name and you'll find me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To listen to more and to subscribe to Faith Today, Canada's Christian magazine, please visit www.theefc.ca/faithtoday.